The silence in the San Antonio church was heavy, a thick blanket laid over the hushed congregation. Pastor Elias Thorne stood at the pulpit, not with his usual booming confidence, but with a quiet, almost unsettling stillness. In his hand, he held a single, aged letter. The air felt charged, anticipating something momentous. He cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the quiet, reading words that were not his own, but from an anonymous source. To the esteemed members of this congregation, let it be known that your beloved Pastor Elias Thorne, in the year of our Lord 1897, committed a profound betrayal against a vulnerable woman. He manipulated her trust, exploited her faith, and left her shattered, all for his own calculated gain. Each word landed like a stone, sinking into the collective consciousness of the people before him. The letter detailed a calculated manipulation, a cold-hearted misuse of spiritual authority. It spoke of promises whispered in confidence, of a heart laid bare and then ruthlessly trampled. There was no room for doubt in the stark, precise accusations. It wasn't vague. It painted a clear picture of a man who had used his position not to uplift, but to destroy. A gasp rippled through the pews. Faces shifted from confusion to shock, then to outrage. Whispers began to spread, a low hum of disbelief. But Elias, instead of flinching, instead of denying, calmly and almost chillingly acknowledged the truth. His eyes, usually warm and inviting, now held a strange, distant glint as he swept them across the stunned faces. "The words you have just heard," he stated, his voice steady, "are true. Every single one of them." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air, a confession that seemed to defy all expectation. The full story, and its consequences, will now unfold. Not just for me, but for all involved. A visible ripple of unease passed through the congregation, more pronounced than before. It wasn't just shock anymore. It was a dawning comprehension of something far deeper and more dangerous. In the front row, a prominent elder, Mr. Peterson, a man whose stern presence usually commanded respect, stood up slowly. His face was pale, visibly shaken, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and recognition. He looked directly at Elias, a silent question passing between them. Elias's gaze remained impassive. He held the letter tighter, his knuckles white. The weight of his words, of the past he had just unveiled, settled over the room. "For every seed sown in darkness," Elias intoned, his voice now carrying a haunting echo, "a harvest awaits in the light." The phrase hung in the air, a chilling prophecy. Suddenly, Mr. Peterson gasped. He clutched his chest, his eyes rolling back slightly. His knees buckled, and he collapsed back into the pew, a low groan escaping his lips. Other congregants cried out, rushing forward, but Elias remained at the pulpit, unmoving, the anonymous letter still clutched firmly in his hand. The true extent of the unfolding drama, the depth of the betrayal, and the nature of the harvest remained unknown. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. We need to go back in time, all the way to 1897. San Antonio back then was a really interesting place. It wasn't the big city we know today, but it was growing fast. You could still see bits of its Wild West past with cowboys and dusty streets, but electric lights were starting to pop up and there was a real sense of things changing. It was a melting pot too, with people from all over speaking different languages, all trying to make a life for themselves. The community was pretty tight-knit, especially among folks who shared a church. The church played a huge role in daily life. It wasn't just a place for Sunday services, it was the center of social life where people found comfort, guidance, and community. Because of this, there were a lot of expectations on people, especially women and men of faith. Reputation was everything, and straying from the path could mean real trouble. Economically, it was a time of both chances and real struggle. If you were smart and worked hard, you could build something. But if you fell on hard times, there wasn't much of a safety net. This is the San Antonio where Elias Thorne arrived. He was a young pastor, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, full of energy and big plans. He wasn't from a rich family. You could tell he'd worked for everything he had, but he had this charisma, this way of speaking that drew people in. He wanted to make a name for himself, to build a powerful church that would be remembered. He saw San Antonio as his chance, a new frontier for his ministry. His ambition was like a fire inside him. It gave him drive, but it also made him a little blind to things outside his own goals. He dreamed of leaving a lasting legacy, of being a truly influential figure, and he believed God had put him there to do it. His ambition was a double-edged sword. It pushed him to work tirelessly, to preach with passion, to connect with people, but it also meant he was always looking for ways to grow his influence, sometimes without fully considering the cost. He wanted recognition, respect, and to see his vision for the church come to life. These dreams were central to who he was, driving every decision he made. It was during this time that he met Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a quiet woman, very devout, who lived a bit on the edge of town. She was probably in her early 40s, and there was a noticeable loneliness about her. Maybe she had lost family, or perhaps just hadn't found her place in the bustling new city. Whatever the reason, she was isolated. Her faith was deep, a cornerstone of her life, and she yearned for connection, for someone to understand her spiritual path. This yearning, this need for belonging, was her biggest vulnerability. She was genuinely a good person, trusting and sincere, and she believed wholeheartedly in the power of faith and the goodness of those who preached it. Elias, with his compelling sermons and his apparent dedication, seemed like an answer to her prayers. He became a figure of hope for her, someone who could offer spiritual guidance and understanding. He took the time to listen to her, to talk about her faith, to make her feel seen. He was her confidant, her mentor, at a time when she desperately needed one. This laid the groundwork for everything that would follow, for the complex and ultimately damaging relationship that would unfold between them. Sarah saw a shepherd. Elias saw an opportunity. The early days of Elias and Sarah's interactions seemed innocent enough, at least on the surface. Elias, with his comforting words and patient demeanor, quickly became a central figure in Sarah's quiet life. He listened intently to her struggles, her hopes, and her interpretations of Scripture. He spoke of spiritual partnership, of a shared journey to build God's kingdom right there in San Antonio. He hinted at a future where her deep faith would be recognized and utilized within the growing mission. These weren't outright promises, but vague, comforting suggestions that made Sarah feel valued and seen. She held on to these words, believing in the sincerity behind them, not realizing they were hollow, designed to weave a web of dependence. As time went on, these promises, though never explicitly broken, simply faded into the background, replaced by new, more subtle forms of control. There were small moments, almost imperceptible at first, where Elias would gently correct Sarah's theological understanding in front of others, always with a soft smile, yet leaving her feeling a little foolish. He would suggest that her ideas, while well-intentioned, might be too emotional or lack the necessary theological rigor for the mission's public face. These veiled criticisms were always framed as spiritual counsel, meant to guide her, but they chipped away at her confidence. He'd commend her piety, but then imply her judgment needed his superior wisdom. These small, seemingly insignificant acts subtly undermined Sarah's self-worth, always under the guise of concern for her soul. Elias slowly began to exert more control over Sarah's life. He'd influence her decisions about how she spent her time, suggesting that certain social gatherings were not conducive to spiritual growth or that her resources could be better used for the church. He even started to shape her interpretation of Scripture, gently guiding her towards readings that emphasized obedience and submission, especially for women. He encouraged her to distance herself from older friends who might, he implied, distract her from her spiritual path, or whose views might not align with the burgeoning church's doctrine. This isolated her further, making Elias her primary, and often only, confidant and guide. There were specific instances where Elias benefited directly from Sarah's trust and resources, while offering her little in return. Sarah, with her modest inheritance, often contributed generously to the mission, seeing it as her way to support God's work. Elias would accept these contributions with gratitude, praising her faith, but he rarely reciprocated with any tangible support for her own needs. Once, when Sarah needed help with a repair on her small home, Elias suggested she pray on it rather than offering practical assistance, despite the church having funds. Another time, he encouraged her to sell a small parcel of land, stating the proceeds would be vital for the new church building, promising her a special place in the congregation's heart. He took the money, and while the church building progressed, her special place never materialized beyond a few kind words. In 1897, San Antonio, a woman's reputation and her dependence on male authority were paramount. Sarah, a single woman, was already in a vulnerable position. Elias exploited this cultural context perfectly. His subtle manipulations were hard to challenge because they were always cloaked in religious piety and concern. To question him would be to question God's chosen messenger, to challenge the very foundations of her faith and her standing in the community. Her predicament was made all the more poignant by the era's societal norms. She had few avenues for recourse outside the church, and even fewer ways to articulate the insidious nature of the control Elias wielded. The audience now understood that the initial event, the letter read in Part 1, was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a slow, insidious erosion of trust and dignity, a long, drawn-out process that had systematically stripped Sarah of her independence and self-worth. Elias hadn't just betrayed her in one grand gesture, he had been chipping away at her for years, building his own kingdom on the foundation of her unwavering faith and desperate yearning for connection. The emotional atmosphere between Elias and Sarah grew heavy, almost suffocating. It became clear to Sarah that Elias was increasingly demanding, his dismissiveness of her feelings and needs growing more pronounced with each passing week. He no longer bothered with the pretense of seeking her input on church matters, instead presenting his decisions as final, often with a dismissive wave of his hand if she dared to offer a different perspective. Their interactions, once a source of comfort for Sarah, now felt like walking on thin ice. There were intensifying conflicts, though never outright arguments. Sarah, still holding on to a sliver of her former self, would sometimes try to assert herself, perhaps by suggesting a different approach to a community outreach program or by gently questioning a sermon point she found particularly harsh. Elias would meet these attempts not with anger, but with spiritual platitudes. He'd remind her of the importance of humility, of trusting God's plan as revealed through his chosen leaders, or more cuttingly, imply that her questions stemmed from a lack of true faith. These subtle rebukes were more damaging than any shouting match, as they forced Sarah to internalize her frustrations, making her believe her own doubts were a spiritual failing. The nascent church community, which Elias had so carefully cultivated, began to cast subtle judgment on Sarah. Elias, through his sermons and private conversations, had skillfully painted a picture of Sarah as a devout, but perhaps overly dependent woman who relied too heavily on his spiritual guidance. Neighbors and fellow parishioners, influenced by Elias's charismatic leadership, started to view Sarah with a mixture of pity and thinly veiled disapproval. Her continued isolation, which Elias himself had orchestrated, was now seen as a personal failing, a sign that she was not fully embracing the communal spirit of the church. This social pressure further isolated Sarah, making her feel like an outsider in the very place she had sought belonging. Elias's true nature started to emerge more clearly. His ambition, once subtly veiled beneath a cloak of piety, now became ruthless. He focused relentlessly on expanding the church, on attracting new members, and on securing donations, often at the expense of genuine pastoral care. His empathy for Sarah, always limited, had diminished to almost nothing. She was no longer a person to him, but a resource, a testament to his spiritual authority, or an obstacle to be managed. His focus was entirely on his own advancement and image, and Sarah's quiet needs simply did not fit into that picture. He spoke of grand plans for the church, of becoming a leading voice in San Antonio, and Sarah could feel herself shrinking in his shadow. Sarah felt the heavy burden of judgment, both real and imagined. She caught whispers, saw the disapproving glances, and felt the chill of unspoken gossip. Parishioners, influenced by Elias's carefully crafted narrative, misinterpreted her situation. They saw her quiet demeanor not as a sign of her gentle nature, but as timidity, perhaps even a lack of conviction. Her continued presence near the church, still clinging to the hope of spiritual solace, was viewed by some as an unhealthy attachment to the pastor, rather than a desperate yearning for the connection she had lost. The weight of these misinterpretations pressed down on her, adding to her already profound sense of loneliness. This period represented Sarah's deepest emotional entrapment. She felt utterly alone, unheard, and unable to escape the intricate web Elias had woven around her. Every path she considered seemed to lead back to him, or to further isolation. Her faith, once a steadfast anchor, now felt twisted and used against her. She was caught, a bird in a cage, just before a critical turning point that would either break her completely or force her to find a strength she never knew she possessed. The air around her was thick with unspoken resentment and a growing sense of dread, a silent countdown to something inevitable. One afternoon, the critical turning point arrived with a sudden, devastating clarity. Sarah was helping clean the church after a midweek service, a task she often volunteered for, finding a quiet solace in the familiar routine. She was in the small antechamber, stacking hymn books, when she heard voices from Elias's study next door. The door was slightly ajar, and Elias's voice, usually so smooth and reassuring, was sharp, dismissive. He was speaking to one of the church elders, Mr. Henderson, about the ongoing plans for the new mission building. "And what about Sister Jenkins?" Mr. Henderson asked softly. "She's been very devoted, Father. Perhaps a small role in the women's auxiliary?" Elias scoffed, a sound that chilled Sarah to her core. "Sister Jenkins? Oh, she means well, bless her heart. But she's a project, Mr. Henderson. A testament to God's mercy, perhaps, but hardly leadership material. Her contributions are limited. Best keep her busy with the cleaning. It keeps her out of the way and feeling useful." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "She's too emotionally invested, you see. A bit of a drain, frankly, on my energy and the church's resources. We need strong, independent women for this new chapter, not those who cling to every word like a lifeline." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Project, limited, drain, cling. Every carefully constructed illusion, every shred of hope she had nurtured, shattered in that instant. It wasn't just a simple dismissal. It was a complete invalidation of her worth, her faith, her very being. He saw her as a burden, a problem to be managed, not a soul to be nurtured. The contempt in his voice was unmistakable, stripping away the last vestiges of his spiritual facade. It revealed his true motives, pure self-advancement, with no regard for the vulnerable souls he claimed to shepherd. In the wake of this brutal betrayal, Sarah felt a profound shift within her. The years of subtle manipulation, the broken promises, the veiled humiliations, the emotional suffocation, they all coalesced into a burning, resolute decision. She was done. Done with being a project. Done with being managed. Done with being diminished. A quiet fury, cold and steady, began to simmer beneath her shock. She would reclaim her agency no matter the cost. Later that week, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. Sarah was at the general store, buying a few necessities, her mind still reeling from Elias's words. She overheard a conversation between the shopkeeper and a woman she vaguely recognized, Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Mrs. Vance was a widow, known for her sharp mind and independent spirit, a woman who often spoke her mind, even when it wasn't popular. She was discussing the recent arrival of a new legal aid office in San Antonio, funded by a group of forward-thinking benefactors from back east. The office, she explained, was specifically set up to help women and the disadvantaged navigate a legal system that often overlooked their needs. "They say they're looking to hear stories, especially of those who feel wronged but have no voice," Mrs. Vance remarked to the shopkeeper. Imagine that, a place where a woman might actually be heard. Sarah felt a jolt, a pathway, a chance. It was a faint glimmer, but it was there, outside the suffocating influence of Elias and his church. It was an external support, a potential legal avenue, however nascent in that era for a woman like her. The thought was terrifying, bringing with it the fear of public shame, but also a burgeoning sense of hope. This moment shattered the illusion Elias had so carefully constructed, not just for Sarah, but potentially for a wider audience, though the full impact was yet to unfold. This was the definitive end of Sarah's silent suffering and the beginning of her fight for justice, fundamentally altering the narrative's direction. She clutched her small bag of groceries, her knuckles white, and walked out of the store with a new purpose. Sarah walked home, the weight of Elias's betrayal heavy on her, yet mixed with this strange new resolve. A maelstrom of emotions swirled inside her, profound grief for the trust she had placed in him, a trust now shattered beyond repair, intense fear of what Elias might do if she truly acted on this newfound path, shame, deep and burning for her past vulnerability, for allowing herself to be so completely manipulated, but beneath it all, a burgeoning sense of righteous anger, a fire she hadn't known she possessed. She had been a fool, yes, but she would not remain one. Doubt gnawed at her. Was she doing the right thing? The church was everything in San Antonio. To speak out against a pastor, especially one as charismatic as Elias, would invite public scorn, perhaps even spiritual damnation in the eyes of many. People might call her hysterical, a jilted woman, or worse. She pictured the whispers, the averted gazes, the way her name would be dragged through the mud. The thought alone was enough to make her stomach clench, yet the image of Elias's sneering face, his dismissive words, kept pushing her forward. The thought of letting him continue his deceit to perhaps hurt other vulnerable women was even more unbearable. As news of Elias's plans for a grand new church building and his increasingly frequent travels to secure funding spread through the community, a subtle shift began to occur. Not everyone was as blindly devoted as he believed. Mrs. Vance, for one, made pointed comments at the general store about the pastor's growing ambition and how some men forget their flock when chasing bigger pastures. Old Mr. Henderson, who had known Sarah's family for years, started nodding a little too vigorously whenever Sarah spoke, a quiet validation that she hadn't imagined. Even a few of the younger women, who had initially been captivated by Elias's sermons, began to exchange uneasy glances when he spoke of the sacrifices required for the church's greater mission, sacrifices that always seemed to fall on the less fortunate. These small, almost imperceptible signs of doubt provided a fragile lifeline for Sarah, a hint that she might not be entirely alone. But for every flicker of potential support, there were staunch opponents. Deacon Miller, a prosperous merchant who saw his own influence growing under Elias's wing, became a vocal defender of the pastor, dismissing any murmurs of discontent as idle gossip from envious minds. Mrs. Perkins, a woman who prided herself on her piety and social standing, actively spread rumors about Sarah's delusional nature and her unseemly attachment to the pastor. These individuals, deeply entrenched in Elias's faction, actively worked to discredit Sarah, protecting their own interests and the carefully constructed image of their leader. The cultural dynamics of San Antonio in 1897 amplified the stakes. The community, with its strong religious and social hierarchies, was ill-equipped to handle such a scandal. The pressure to maintain appearances was immense. A woman's reputation was her most valuable and most fragile asset. Divorce was scandalous, and a single woman accusing a man of the cloth, especially without tangible proof, was almost unheard of. The limited recourse for women in that era meant that Sarah's path would be fraught with peril, her word against a powerful man's. The very structure of society was designed to silence her. Sarah's journey through this period was marked by intense psychological turmoil. Sleepless nights were filled with agonizing replays of Elias's words, followed by furious imaginings of her confrontation. Her appetite waned. Her once bright eyes often held a distant, troubled look. Yet, with each passing day, a growing resilience took root. The fear remained, a constant companion, but it was slowly overshadowed by a fierce determination. She found her voice, not in outward proclamations, but in the quiet, steady conviction forming within her. She was resolved to confront her abuser, not just for herself, but for the principle of it, for the truth. The legal aid office, with its promise of a voice for the voiceless, became her beacon, a tangible hope in a world designed to keep her silent. She knew the fight ahead would be brutal, but she also knew she could not, would not, back down. Sarah began the arduous process of rebuilding her life. The first step was leaving San Antonio. The whispers, the judgment, the constant reminder of Elias made it impossible to heal there. She moved to a small town further west, a place where no one knew her story, where she could be just Sarah, not the woman who accused the pastor. She found work as a seamstress, her skilled hands finding solace in the rhythmic hum of the machine. The work was honest, the pay modest, but it gave her independence. She joined a small, quiet church, one where the minister spoke of grace and forgiveness, not power and earthly ambition. Slowly, painstakingly, she stitched her broken pieces back together. Her allies in San Antonio, particularly the quiet Mr. Henderson and the increasingly vocal Mrs. Vance, continued their work. They had gathered testimonies, not just from Sarah, but from others who had felt Elias's manipulative touch. They found former church members who had left under similar, though less dramatic, circumstances. It was a slow, uphill battle. The legal aid office, true to its word, prepared a detailed account, a formal complaint outlining Elias's financial impropriations and his emotional abuse, carefully framing it within the legal and social norms of the time. They knew a full criminal conviction was unlikely, given the lack of physical evidence and the power dynamics, but they aimed for public exposure and ecclesiastical censure. The confrontation came not in a courtroom, but in a closed-door meeting with the regional church council. Sarah, accompanied by Mr. Henderson and a representative from the legal aid office, presented her case. She spoke with a quiet dignity, her voice steady, recounting the years of manipulation, the broken promises, the calculated isolation. The evidence gathered by her allies, though circumstantial, painted a picture too consistent to ignore. Elias, initially defiant, tried to dismiss her, to call her a troubled woman, but the weight of the testimonies, coupled with the meticulous records of his financial dealings, began to crack his facade. The consequence for Elias was swift and severe, though not entirely public in the way Sarah might have wished. The church, eager to avoid a full-blown scandal that would tarnish its name, quietly removed him from his San Antonio post. He was stripped of his pastoral duties indefinitely, his reputation within the ecclesiastical circles utterly ruined. There was no public trial, no grand pronouncement, but for Elias, a man whose entire identity was wrapped in his ministry and public image, it was a profound and crushing defeat. He left San Antonio under a cloud of shame, his grand ambitions shattered, his influence evaporated. He was never heard from again in any position of authority. Sarah, though not fully vindicated in the public eye, found a deeper peace. The letter read in part 1 years later was her final act of justice. It was not written by her, but by one of her allies, ensuring the truth would eventually surface, long after Elias thought he had escaped judgment. It was a testament to her quiet strength, a final echo of her voice. She had not only survived, but had rebuilt, finding a faith that was truly her own, untainted by the manipulations of men. Her life, though marked by hardship, became a quiet testament to resilience, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, truth, however slowly, finds its way to the light. The experience taught her that justice wasn't always loud or immediate, but it was often enduring, a slow burn that eventually consumed the darkness. Her story, passed down through whispers and eventually in a letter, served as a quiet warning, a testament to the enduring power of truth against the abuse of power.